So here's a question for you. Imagine you hire someone for a job and they do, let's say, 99% of it perfectly. Do you have to pay them? For over 150 years, the law had a really harsh answer. Absolutely not. Today, we're going to dig into the 5 landmark cases that completely flipped that script. We'll trace how contract law evolved from demanding absolute perfection to something a lot more practical. All right, let's get into it. This list right here, this is our source material for today. It might just look like 5 cases with some dates next to them, but trust me, these cases tell a pretty incredible story about fairness, common sense, and how the law has to change with the times. Because, that's really what this is. It's a story. It's a narrative that stretches across almost 2 centuries, and it shows us how a really fundamental part of our legal system went from having these super rigid black and white rules to the more nuanced, flexible principles that we actually use today. But before we jump into the cases themselves, we need to set the stage a little. To really get what's going on, we have to be totally clear on the 2 core ideas at the heart of this whole legal drama. On the surface, it sounds super simple, right? Performance means you do what you promise to do. A breach is when you don't. But the real question, the one that these 5 cases all grapple with, is, well, how perfect does that performance have to be? And what's the fair thing to do when it's not quite perfect? To find the answer to that, we have to go way back. We're talking about the late 18th century, where our story kicks off with a rule that was, frankly, incredibly harsh. And check this out. What's so wild about this timeline is just the sheer size of that gap. You've got one case in 1795, and the next one isn't until 1952. That's 157 years. It just goes to show how powerful and untouchable that first legal principle was. For more than a century and a half, one case ruled them all. And this is the one, Cutter v. Powell. It's a tragic story, actually. A sailor was hired for a long voyage from Jamaica to Liverpool. He was promised a big payday when the ship arrived. But he died just a few weeks before they reached port. So this case ended up setting the standard, a really strict rule of absolute, perfect completion. The decision from that case created what's known as the entire obligations rule. And it was brutal. The court said that because Mr. Cutter didn't complete the entire trip, his widow got nothing, not a single penny. It was all or nothing. You could do 99% of the work, but if you didn't finish that last 1%, you got paid 0. Okay, now let's fast forward to the 20th century. You can probably imagine that as the world got more complex, this old, rigid rule just wasn't cutting it anymore. The law had to adapt and become more flexible. And you can literally see the pace of change speed up right here. Just look at how bunched together these are. 4 huge cases in just 32 years. This shows a legal system in rapid-fire evolution, with judges really wrestling with these ideas and refining them over a pretty short period. So the first real crack in that old rule comes with Honeck v. Isaacs. Here's the deal. An interior decorator was hired to furnish an apartment. The client refused to pay the final amount because of a few minor issues, like a wardrobe door that didn't close properly. The court came up with a game-changing idea, substantial performance. They said, look, the job is basically done. The decorator should get paid, and we'll just deduct the small amount it cost to fix the defects. It was a massive step towards fairness. Then, just 10 years later, White and Carter v. McGregor comes along and asks this really tricky new question. Let's say someone cancels a contract with you. Do you have to just accept that, stop work, and sue them for damages? Or can you just ignore their cancellation, go ahead and finish the job anyway, and then send them the bill for the full price? And then the plot thickens with this case. Hounslow? It basically puts a limit on that White and Carter rule. It says that the innocent party can't just insist on finishing the contract if they need the other person's active cooperation to do it. You can't force your way onto their property to keep building something they've already told you they don't want. And that brings us to the last case on our list, the Alaskan Trader, which adds this final modern layer of nuance. It sharpens the White and Carter rule even more by adding a really important test. It says that if you want to ignore a cancellation and keep performing the contract, you have to have a legitimate interest in doing so. You can't just say, keep a whole ship and its crew on standby for months just to rack up a huge bill if there's no real commercial reason for it. So here's the bottom line. It's really crucial to see that these 5 cases aren't just random points in time. They actually connect to tell a single, coherent story about the law's journey, a journey towards finding that sweet spot between certainty and fairness. And here it is, the whole journey laid out in one place. You can really see that massive leap from the 18th century foundation of Cutter v. Powell to the quick, intense refinement that happened in the 20th century. Together, they built the rules that we all live by today. So the main thing to take away from all this is that understanding this progression is key. It's a journey from a simple but really harsh perfect performance rule to the much more practical idea of substantial performance. And then it gets into the really tricky modern questions about what to do when things go wrong. It's really the story of fairness itself evolving inside the law. Which brings us to one last thought. Our story pretty much stops in 1984. But what about today? In a world of smart contracts that run on code, a global gig economy, and digital deals that cross borders in an instant, what new problem is going to come along and force the courts to write the next chapter? What do you think the next case on this list will be?